welcome everyone. I am really excited about the opportunity to talk to you about systems security engineering and what it means and what I've learned and what I hope to share. I would ask that if you have questions as we go through, please ask them. If it's something I'm going to cover later, I'm happy to do that. If it's something that I didn't think about answering for you ahead of time, that helps me also understand the need. I did put together some slides because I think it's helpful to have a sort of focusing, shaping function. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can do that. There we go. So the topic is systems security engineering, with my subtitle, What It Is and Why It Matters. And I would like to point out that systems engineering and systems security engineering are two very, very similar fields of endeavor. The thing about the systems security engineering is you take on the additional question of what could possibly go wrong, and you approach it from the perspective a person or an entity that wants to make it fail in a variety of different ways. So I think that's a important point about the systems security engineering. A little bit of my background. As Mark noted, I'm a senior cyber advisor at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. I've been there since 2016. Prior to this very, very recent change in position, I was chief scientist for the cyber warfare systems, which is, again, looking at all the different ways that cyber warfare can manifest itself and what sort of systems and capabilities need to support that. Prior to that, a lot of very, very excellent senior technical roles at NSA, where I had the opportunity to dive into an enormous number of different projects and tasks that are all part of, I think, systems engineering or systems security engineering, because you look at things from the broad perspective as well as you dive down deeply into individual piece parts of that. Prior to that, I had a good stint in industry as a standards expert in public key cryptography and directory systems, which are the backbone of many of the security capabilities that we see in our commercial products and technologies today. Before that, I was a Tempest engineer, and that field of endeavor is looking for opportunities or signals leaking out in the RF space, radio frequency space. So cyber encompasses not only the networks and the nodes and the technologies that we're traditionally familiar with over IP-based networks, but there's also an RF component to it. And before that, I got my start as a cryptologic technician with the U.S. Navy. For those of you who have other service experience, I'm going to say go Navy, because it was really, really a wonderful opportunity to serve my country and to make sure that the crypto capabilities that secured the communications for the Navy were kept up and running. So I ended up where I am through a very strange path, but it was all good knowledge for me. So when I think about systems security engineering, the first person that comes to mind in the academic world is a gentleman by the name of Ross Anderson. I will have a link to his book at the end of the talk, and he is a very controversial figure in some ways, but he basically says you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to prevent, and will the mechanisms that you're proposing to use to prevent those failures actually work? And since almost all of us are on cyberspace today in some form or fashion, the canvas on which you do system security engineering is that much broader. So the questions of assurance and security engineering is the system going to work? Very similar to systems engineering. And then its cousin compliance. How do you satisfy people to know that the steps that you've taken, the design trade-offs that you've made, and the approaches that you're taking meet the compliance criteria, that is the legal and regulatory components that you're supposed to meet, but also the functional and operational requirements, and how long is it going to keep on working. So there's a lot of conversation about using the term resiliency is a system going to be resilient in the face of a cyber attack? That's subset or a corollary to system security or cybersecurity. And I think the terms can almost be used interchangeably. So when I think about what does it take and what do you need to know about to be a system security engineer, I found this WordPill example of all of the piece parts that go into system security engineering and the skill sets and the experiences and the domains within which you may need to work. And what comes out of this to me is it's a team sport. You really, really need to have people who understand the math of cryptography, the human behaviors of designing interfaces and understanding what security techniques are going to be acceptable by people and which ones are just going to be too hard, and you really want to make sure that the underlying software or the firmware or the technology handles it itself. There's a strong psychology component. There's a big component of just thinking about how do you take actions and understand what malicious people or hackers might do. There's coursework that you'll find now called ethical hacking. So part of system security engineering would require a group or a person or a set of tools or capabilities to come in and say, how could I do damage to this system while not actually doing the damage, but what are the ways that I could go in and disrupt the function of what this system does? And I have yet to find all those skills in one person, but I've certainly had the pleasure of working with really good teams of people who bring all of those skills and experience to bear to be able to make sure that the security engineering aspects are covered and covered appropriately.
Sandi, we have a question from one of our students. It says, what did your schooling consist of to reach where you are now?
Okay. So I started out with the U.S. Navy's Electronic Warfare School. From there, I got a EE degree, and then I realized that the hardware that was in play at the time that I got the degree was going to very, very rapidly be overtaken by software. So I went and I got an undergrad and a grad degree in computer science. And then now what I'm finding is that the speed and scale at which information is ricocheting around the world, we're back to the hardware because the software just cannot keep up with terabits or exabits of information, and the security components that are necessary to protect and defend boundaries typically are running in the hundreds of gigabits, and software is just not going to be able to do that. So I'm finding myself relying more and more on my early EE training and going back to hardware. So from a formal education process, I am almost purely STEM in terms of technical engineering. And what I'm finding also that as I get into more systems thinking, I'm picking up and taking more psychology courses to understand how influence operations work, how people use or choose not to use security tools. And then let's see, the other thing is just if you have an insatiable curiosity, that's to me is the most important skill, to be able to dive into something and take it as far left and right or up and down that you can take it to just look at a system in its entirety. So I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Sandi.
So let's see. System security engineering, as I already mentioned, is building systems that remain dependable in the face of a cyber attack. And there's an awful lot of public domain information out there. What are the most common forms of attacks? I recommend Verizon puts an annual report out. CrowdStrike puts an annual report out. There's a lot of information that you can get for free and on the internet about what are the types of attacks that are being used and are in play today. The NSA folks put together something called the Technical Threat Framework, which is also referred to as the kill chain. So you can look at the different ways that an adversary would build a set of stages and objectives and actions in order to create some form of effect. I would also caveat that sometimes you as the operator maintainer of that system are not going to know whether something is a cyber attack or a flaw failure until you do the forensics. So forensic skills are teachable. They also really rely on curiosity. And sometimes we don't know that we've been attacked until well after the fact. There are stories in the press. They're not stories. There are reports in the press. Adversaries sitting in systems for very, very long times because of the ways that you go looking at your system. You don't always know that the adversary is in there. So you focus on the tools, processes, and methods that not only for the design, the implement, and testing of complex large systems, but what you do to evolve them and how do you make systems modular enough that if there's a fatal flaw in any one part of it, it's relatively straightforward and cost effective to replace that piece part of it. An anecdote that struck me several years ago, I was on the group of people who wrote the Trusted Platform Module 2.0 specification. That's a chipset with the right firmware on board to be the genesis of your asserting of your security properties. And one of the major chip vendors at the time, Intel, told us that they were happy to incorporate additional security features and functions, and only if the cost of the countermeasure, that is the security technique that would make the chip stronger, was less than 7 cents a chip. And you sit there and you go, wow, that's a really low number. And then you realize at the time, Intel was making build runs of about 1 million chips a day. So for them, anything over $70,000 a day, which is a bigger number to deal with, to fix their chip manufacturing was out of the question. So sometimes when you as a system security engineer find a flaw and think you have a design or a method to fix that flaw, you have to take the economics into consideration because it is something that is necessary and essential. Sometimes security practitioners feel like evangelists in the wilderness because in business today, the cost of doing something is going to be the primary driver for whether or not something is fixable or not. And as I mentioned earlier with the word pill diagram, the cross-disciplinary skills. So again, I started in cryptography and went into hardware engineering, then went into software development. I will say that I write really bad software. So it is a lesson that I learned early on that people who are able to write elegant, crisp, and concise code are worth their weight in gold, and I love working with them. The other one is threat intelligence gathering and analysis. If you're familiar with NIST's common vulnerability enumeration and common weakness enumeration, coupled with two tools that are done when you're doing software development, you have something called static analysis. That is a tool that runs over the software that is written and identifies anything that could possibly be viewed as a vulnerability. But then you run something called a dynamic analysis in the context of within which the software is going to be run. And it will further refine what it is you really need to care about in context. Threat intelligence gathering is exactly like that. You can find threats information about those threats that will overwhelm you if you don't do the necessary analysis that says, well, what is really relevant and important to the system that I am working with and that I am managing and maintaining? Because not all threats are of equal importance and not all threats are of equal relevance. That also leads into adversary techniques and tactics. It's kind of like playing chess. In some cases, they've got tactics and techniques that you just need to be aware of. And in other cases, you need to figure out what your counter role and counterplay is going to be. I mentioned earlier the business process analysis. That's the cost piece of it. Presentation and people skills storytelling. As a security practitioner, it's not very effective to go into your management and go, the sky is falling. I've got to do all of these things. You need to be able to tell a story about why is what you found and what you are proposing to do to repair or mitigate the vulnerability in this system important to the people who are going to make the decision about accepting or not accepting those recommendations. And then finally, above all, curiosity. I can find myself starting, I like to follow dark reading. It's one of the references. I've got it in my references slide. I'll open up an article and it'll talk about some prior art that would led to that research or that article. And the next thing I know, I've spent about 5 or 6 hours chasing something. But at the end of it, I always come out smarter than I started. And I think that I attribute that to just being a naturally curious person.
Hey, Sandi, I have a couple more questions for you.
Oh, sure.
We have one that says, was there any setbacks that you had when you were pursuing this career, and what might they be?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, software development, I am, no doubt about it, a really crummy coder. I don't have the attention to detail to make sure that all of my parentheticals match and that I haven't inserted extra characters in there or that I haven't completed the expressions properly. So when I hit something that I know I don't necessarily have the innate skill or ability to do, I look to see, are there surrounding or correlating skills that could be used as part of that. So recognizing my own strengths and weaknesses is really important. And then in some cases, if it's a topic that I'm not quite ready to learn, I don't discard it completely. Make sure that I go back and revisit it at some future time to find out whether or not I just wasn't ready for it or it truly isn't something that I'm good at.
Oh, excellent answer. Here's another really cool question. How is the physical infrastructure protected, and whose job, that's the good one, whose job is it to come up with that plan?
That's a really, really outstanding question, because when you look at the breadth and depth of how an adversary's tactic or technique is going to be implemented, there are a couple of things that come to bear in the physical environment protection, and there are a series of security controls or requirements, if you will, about physical environment protection. You'll find that some places are very, very rigorous about who actually is allowed in to come in on campus or to come into the buildings, or you'll find like data centers. First of all, most of the Amazon data centers are not on any maps, and they have a purpose for that. And then other data centers, you'll find that maintenance people are escorted the whole time that they are in there. So the job of the systems security engineer is to say, if we have a vulnerability or a high risk of something happening and it's too expensive to fix it in software or hardware, and what we're going to do is we're going to limit physical access to it, how would an adversary try to get in there physically and do something, that's part of system security engineering. So I think understanding the ways that you can cost effectively implement controls or physical controls, sometimes that can do more good than all the complicated software that you might want to think about developing.
Thanks, Sandi.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have some other really good questions, but I don't want to take away from the other charts that you have. So I'll give you the questions and then you can say, hey, let me finish up this and we'll get back to it. But this question is, how much is the workload in the field? That's question one. And then what does TPM, I would think that would be the trusted modules, do to improve system security, and how does it do its job? So those are two questions, and we can come back to them or we can take them right now.
So I think I'd like to get through my slides and I can get back to those. TPM is a longer answer than a quick one. So I think I'll go through my slides quickly.
And I'll hold these questions and we'll come back around to them.
Okay. So one of the things that I just recently did was I was a election judge for my local county for this presidential election that we just had. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes on voting system and some security around the voting system that I thought was relevant. So I chose a couple of the components in the voting system. I identify them, I talk about some hacks, and then what you could do to mitigate them. This is by no means meant to represent that any of this happened. This was more a discussion example for a system that is worth what a system security engineer would think about. So in my county, there were poll books that are tied back to the back-end database at the Board of Elections. And the poll book judge verifies the voter information when a person comes up to them, determines the ballot selection. And one of the challenges that we had in our particular election this year was due to COVID, we only had a few early voting locations opened, and we have about 195 precincts in our county. So making sure that the voter got the right ballot with the right local issues to them was part of this process. And the hacks that could have been in the system, again, this is looking at what could possibly go wrong, was any kind of malware installed before it was shipped or while it's being utilized. Were there bad barcodes in there? Is there a denial of service attack? That is, can you stop the poll book from communicating with the back-end database? Or could someone ride the Wi-Fi connection from outside the area where the poll book was into the back-end system to create some disruption? So the mitigations that they did were there were functional tests done during the early voting. There were a lot of tamper evidence techniques applied to all of the pieces of the system. And then they had the backup paper rolls in place. One of the things that if you did deny service to the back-end system and the backup paper rolls were only as good as the most recent printout, there could have been some voting issues, but none of them appeared from the poll book perspective. The second thing that happens is once you get your voter card to go back to pick up your ballot, there are long form, your paper copies. There are cards for people who, if you'll see the picture down at the bottom, wanted to use the electronic system as opposed to filling out all the circles with a pen. And then there was another option for getting forms emailed to you, but those email forms were not readable by the scanning systems in there on purpose. It was a way of making sure that any one voter didn't end up with multiple ballots. So the hacks that could have been in place would be collusion. That's when two people decide they're going to work together to create some negative effect, or any kind of overwriting of the express vote ballots. And the mitigations that took place was 2PI stands for two-person integrity. And in the voting system, in almost every single one that I've ever participated in, they require a Democrat and a Republican to participate in every single step of the process. And when reports are run on the hour, they require both parties to sign off on the results of that hourly test. So unless you can get, people from different parties to collude together, it's very, very difficult for that to be a hack that's effective. And then the other one is the tamper evidence seals. As I mentioned previously, every single component has a tamper evidence seal on it that demonstrates that nobody has come into and broken into or gained access to any of the piece parts of the voting system while they were not attended, such as overnight. There is security overnight, but for the most part, the tamper evidence seals are a good way to mitigate some of those hacks. And then the third piece of the system was the scanner that actually reads in the ballots, whether they're the long form or the cards, and tabulates the votes. So the thing that the scanner will do is it'll reject the ballot if you overvoted. And in that case, if they tell you to vote for, one dog catcher and you vote for two, it'll reject your ballot. If you undervote and it says vote for two dog catchers and you only vote for one, they'll just notify you undervoted, but you can still get your vote cast. And there's really no receipt that comes from the scanner, but when the scanner is complete, it says your ballot has been scanned, your vote has been counted, thank you for voting. And then that voter card that you were given way back when you stood at the poll book gets logged into the system. So there's a complete and total paper trail in the state of Maryland for people to go back and take a look at it. The hacks that would probably be relevant in this one would be to do something with the vote tally on the memory devices. And the mitigation there, again, is tamper protection on the vote tallies and two-person integrity on any actions that are taken on the memory devices. So this was just a systems security engineering example of what is the system supposed to do, what are the things that could go wrong from an adversary or a threat perspective, and then what are some of the mitigations that could be in place. And you will always end up with residual risk. But then the decision is how bad is the residual risk and what are some techniques that I can apply. Back to the question about the physical controls, are there things that I can do that can mitigate those risks that are not going to be significantly expensive in the design and testing and deployment of the system? So there were some Q&As here about the typical day in the life. My day in the life really depends on what my role was at the time. When I was in the Navy, I was responsible for making sure the systems were up and running. When they weren't working, I was there fixing it. Where I am at APL, it's looking at hard problems and making sure people do their due diligence with hard problems. So the next one about the best and most challenging parts. I love my work. I've been so very, very fortunate. The worst part is the cyber adversary never, ever, ever lets up. It's a constant threat, and they adapt their techniques as fast, if not faster, than we adapt our countermeasures. I already talked a little bit about the background and the training and certifications. There's model development analysts, statisticians, mathematicians, that they're necessary and essential in system security engineering, because much like security engineering modeling, you need to be able to model what could possibly go wrong. And I think that gets complicated and complex, and it's much less expensive to be able to do it in a model than to try to do it in systems that you're developing. The future of this field is very, very bright. I see that there's, opportunity for people to participate in almost any aspect of this. One thing I read about recently, about maybe 10 days ago, that I had not ever thought about was field research in endangered species are finding that poachers are getting into their systems so they can find out where the animals are, where the researchers are studying them, and get there and poach them as part of whatever, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to get too worked up about poachers, but that's another area where field researchers can look at their systems and find out ways to be more secure so that poachers won't get to the data and kill the animals. So gaining the experience necessary, start with your school and your community resources, and try something new. One of the things that I've always done is taken stuff apart and tried putting it together in different ways. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then looking at anything from when you're out and about doing something, how does something get from start to finish? When you look at like your grocery store, if you're going to the grocery store and you're seeing something in there, think about how did that get there and what were all the possible ways that that process could have been executed. And then always ask yourself, how could something happen that would make this work in a way that it wasn't intended to work? But my resources that I wanted to make sure that folks had the opportunity to take a look at are, again, Ross Anderson. This is his third version of his security engineering book. His first and second version are online and they are available. Bruce Schneier has blogs that talk about a variety of different pieces of security that are sometimes not as useful or relevant as others. Then in government resources, there's NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology, has a special publication, 160 version 1, which is System Security Engineering. NSA, there's a Science of Security group that is run out of Vanderbilt University that is a great feed to have. From an academic perspective, Cybrary is a resource that I particularly like because it has a lot of information about the different career fields, and I first started following Cybrary because it has a dynamic chart of all of the policies in the Defense Department associated with security and security engineering, and it was a quick way of getting updates, but it has since branched out. Garfield, and I know, Mark, you know about Garfield, that there's, if you have younger siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins, getting people to think about being cyber safe at a very early age is really, really important. I mentioned dark reading. Dark reading is a magazine, online magazine that has a lot of interesting information about what's happening with threats and trends. And then women in cybersecurity is a good one because I'm a strong advocate. More women in STEM that are able to even out the playing field, especially when we look at AI and machine learning and what that's going to mean in terms of machine bias. The more perspectives we have into the development of that, going to make sure that we have better systems in the future. So that's my last slide. And to go back to the question about the workload in the field, is there a little more amplification on what's meant by workload? Is that like career opportunity, or, whether you be working 120 hours a week?
We'll let that person go ahead and send us some additional information on that. And while they're doing that, why don't we talk about another one that goes back to your voting descriptions. And it says, so if you tamper with the seal but don't do anything, does that ruin the system, i.e. invalidate the votes?
Causes consternation, absolutely. And the recount and the rescan and the rework of everything that was done between the last time the seal was checked and the time that the tamper is evident is all considered must be redone. So if you're looking to delay the process, which is one of the 5 Ds in, deny, degrade, delay, disrupt, destroy, then yes, it is a technique that could mean extra work when nothing really happened. But again, in something as critical as this system, you have no alternative but to go back and revalidate the results between the inspection log entries.
Great. And then why don't we go ahead and talk about that TPM question? That do they improve system security, and how does it do its job?
Okay, so a TPM is basically a chip with some firmware on it that identifies the state of the platform in the context of content registers. And the chip will survey the platform, and based on a known good and configured set of registers that are subsequently hashed using, for those who are not familiar with hashing, it's an algorithm that calculates a value over the content of something and then aperiodically recalculates the content to make sure that the hashes match. It continuously does that. So by virtue of having something embedded into your system that takes care of that background underlying process for you, it does increase the security of the system itself. There's a large tail of work that needs to go into configuring the registries and validating the results. And then, of course, if your system is telling you that something is or has gone wrong, you need to be able to take the time and energy to check that out. TPMs have probably been around about 15 years, I think.
Yep.
And they are valuable in cases where you have the infrastructure in place to take advantage of them. I don't think you can buy a laptop today or even in the last 10 years that does not have a TPM in it. It's just the adoption and the uptake of it has been slow because it's not something that does it automatically. There's some work required for it.
Sandi, and we got clarification on the workload in the field. They basically want to know, are we on call 24/7?
Oh, I tell you what, I haven't done 24/7 since I was in the military, except for one stint that I had when I was with the government. No, that depends on your job. And if you do have a job where you are, whether you're IT or cybersecurity part of IT, some jobs will require that of you and other jobs no. So again, when you go back, and I'm just going to cycle back to this picture here, look at all the different things that can go on. If you're generating new software and you're a programmer, chances are your scrums are going to be at a tempo where once you've gone from the development of the software and it's gone into production, you're not on call for the correctness of the production of it. If you are the hacker red team, you're going to find that you may work in strange hours because most of the time they want to see when you go in and get into a system or you're wandering around trying to figure out ways to get into the system, you're going to do it in normal working hours and you're going to do it in off hours if you want to check to see if the intrusion detection prevention systems are paying attention to what you're doing. If you're developing protocols or you're working standards, no, that's not a 24/7 job. There's a lot of collaboration with people across the community, but again, if you're looking at the threat analysis centers, some of those are watch schedules. That is, you work, shift work, and you go in and you keep up with what's going on. And others are just if you're writing the analytics that want to look at the data and come up with results. That can be a normal hours job. I know some people who are some of the better developers I know actually live in places where as long as they've got good broadband and they've got what they need to communicate back and forth, they work on a schedule and a tempo that works for them.
Great. We have what types of general work do the engineers do? Is it mostly collaborative and hands-on, or are there times for individual development?
As an engineer and the experience that I've had, I've done both. I personally really like working in teams, mostly because I don't think of everything. And I like when someone says, well, have you thought about, or what about, or this is what I'm looking at it, thinking about. So I really enjoy teamwork. Believe it or not, I'm an extreme introvert, but being in teams is refreshing for me, and I always learn something. And if you're the kind of person who works by yourself and you can do the research that you need to do, I've worked with researchers in this space who just sit there and sometimes you look at them and you wonder, are you still with us? And they're thinking. They're deep thinkers, and they do best on their own. So whatever is natural to you in terms of your comfort zone, start with that. But then I really encourage you to push against your comfort zone and try something that you don't think you might succeed at first. But you never know. And you're not going to know until you try.
Now, we have a specific one. We're getting close to time here,
Okay.
but it says, from a security engineer standpoint, how do you feel about Intel Management Engine and Intel's approach to source control? Now, I know we really haven't talked about that, but do you have an opinion on that?
So Intel was one of the early proponents of TPM. So I think Intel as a whole has a lot of good practices, and they, on their source control, the whole supply chain and vulnerability management in firmware, that's an entire topic in and of itself. I think Intel may have gone into too much acquisition and expanded rapidly over the last 5 or 7 years. And I think based on some of the things that I'm seeing, they're stepping back and trying to figure out what their core business is, and are their business processes consistent with what that core business is. So it remains to be seen, but I'd love to continue the dialogue at another time about Intel specifically.
Cool. And Sandi, I think we have time for one last question, and it is really a good one. And I really appreciate all the attendees today. These questions have been super. You mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning becoming integrated into cybersecurity. In an increasingly automated world, where would you say machines would do well in maintaining security, and which roles would you say humans are more fit for?
That's an outstanding question that I think about all the time. There's something known as DCO, defensive cyber operations, and I think machines can process known signatures, known vulnerabilities at speeds and scales that humans will never keep up with. Full stop. So if you're looking at your mechanisms that look for anomalies and identify them and raise them up as potential issues, machines are going to beat people out all the time. Be updated by people when people look at what the machine has presented and say, oh, the next time you see this, either flag it as an alarm or let it go. That's where people come in. So there's something called DCO, Defensive Cyber Operations, responsive actions. That's when you take action against something that ideally a very well-tuned and maintained machine has told you. But the decision to take that responsive action has to be done based on laws, policies, and understanding of what the impacts are. And that's where artificial intelligence will come in, but it's not there yet. And then there's a third component of cyber operations warfare called offensive cyber operations. And that's the equivalent of launching a missile, right? And normally we don't let machines do that. And I would hope that we don't let machines do that until we have a much higher degree of confidence that the AI engine that is making that decision and taking that action really knows what it's doing. So that's where I think humans and machines will be working together in cyber.
Thanks a lot, Sandi. And I really appreciate your presentation today. And on behalf of the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation, thank you for being part of our cybersecurity chat week this week. And to all the folks who attended this session, thank you for being here. The questions were wonderful. And you all have a great day.